For part 3 of our intelligence chapter, we're going to be talking about a bunch of our different models of intelligence. How do people think to break down intelligence and describe those different components? So looking overall at how do we actually conceptualize intelligence, and once we have an idea of that, how do we actually measure all of those different components? So when we were talking in some of the other sections, we were looking at those initial IQ tests. And this was all starting our interest in the psychometrics of intelligence. Those early IQ tests reported a single IQ score, and those single scores were meant to quantify intelligence as a whole. And yet, I have been hinting that different people are going to have different opinions on what it actually means to be intelligent. And it isn't always something that can easily be summed up in a single idea or a single thing that makes us intelligent. And so having just that single score might not actually be the best way to try and quantify intelligence. So many different people are going to have come up with their own different models of intelligence, and trying to use those models to find ways to quantify or measure all the different aspects or components of intelligence that they think are important in our understanding and description of those abilities. So we're going to find that it gets a lot more complicated than just a single IQ score. We're going to get into models that include maybe multiple levels, with each having multiple aspects to consider for intelligence. And remember, back in part 1, we talked about our discussion, or sorry, we discussed our data-based versus theory-based approaches, trying to understand how we might develop models for different types of psychometric categories. So this is where we're going to see those different types of approaches, data-focused or theory-driven, for intelligence itself. And you're going to find that some of these are actually going to overlap a little bit, use a little bit of theory and a little bit of data stuff as well, because it's never really quite as clear cut as one or the other. But we are going to start seeing a bunch of different models that lean one way or the other. Our discussion of different theories and models of intelligence is going to start with Charles Spearman, who is somebody who started noticing some patterns when we start looking at different cognitive tests and the scores that people would have when taking these tests. Now, I usually try and think about this in terms of, say, grades in school, because that's a place where we're going to get pretty decent quantification of ability within a whole bunch of different subjects. And it shows this pattern that Spearman started observing. So first off, if intelligence was a single ability, like our original IQ scores would have told us, then we'd find that individuals who are high in this intelligence ability, whatever that sort of contributor is to how we perform, and we're talking sort of generically about something, not really quantified, but something underlying our ability to perform in cognitive tasks. So whatever it is that makes us intelligent. And this can be sort of our discussion on biological factors and stuff that's underlying those abilities, plus all the messy environmental stuff and interactions that stacks on top. But we're mainly focusing on sort of that innate underlying ability that tells us sort of if somebody is going to be intelligent, in quotes, or not. But yeah, so if intelligence is this single ability, if we have this single contributing factor, then we would find that individuals who have a lot of that ability, who score high in terms of that ability, would be good at pretty much all of our intelligence-related tasks. And then, of course, those who are low in that ability would be bad at all of those intelligence-related tasks. But of course, that's not what we see in practice. Because again, I think about this in terms of grades in school. Think back to middle school, high school, or even present day. You're going to find that different individuals are going to be good and bad at different subjects. So somebody might be really good at math, but really bad at creative writing, or good at history, but not so much at music. And this kind of goes against that idea of a single intellectual ability, some single trait that's underlying all of these different intelligence scores, because we're going to find that there is a lot of variation here. And this is something that Spearman ended up noticing, that we're going to see sort of this non-perfect correlation where people who are good at one intelligence or one facet of intelligence are not actually good at absolutely everything. There's variation there. So if we had a single component underlying intelligence, we wouldn't see this discrepancy in performance across different subjects. So there must be something else going on. This is where we get that argument of there must actually be multiple components that are contributing to what we think of as intelligence. So it can't just be a single ability. And again, I'm just sort of stressing that we're still talking very vaguely about stuff that underlies our sort of intellectual abilities. So this is mainly going to be talked about in terms of components or things or like the ability itself, stuff that is contributing to whatever it is we're trying to document and measure and understand. So if you're sort of stuck going, wait, what do we mean by ability? It's a generic term as per usual when we talk about stuff where we don't have a precise definition. So just keep that in mind. But before I run off on that tangent, we're talking about Spearman, who noticed a couple of things. So not only that we have some of these differences across sort of different subjects, but we also see some consistency or even agreement between some scores on our cognitive tasks. So yes, we still have enough variation across different sort of categories or types of tasks that there must be some other factor involved, but having a broad sort of correlation or a broad agreement between scores kind of gives us this idea that while there isn't just a single ability, a single thing that contributes to intelligence, there is something that seems to be going on behind the scenes. And then there are other things on top of that that are going to give us more accurate predictions. So what do we mean by that? First off, let's talk about the concept of a positive manifold. And this is just describing that fact that we do actually see positive correlations when we're looking at individuals' performance on a whole collection of different cognitive tasks. So people who are good students, from my school example, people who are good students tend to do better than average across all of their classes. We're still going to see that they probably have a class that they are the best at and something they are less good at. But overall, they'd probably score pretty high in all of their classes with that variation in between. And somebody who's maybe not a good student is going to score lower than average in multiple of their classes. They might have one class or two that they're better at and others that they are worse at. But overall, we see this pattern where if you tend to score high in one, your score tends to be higher in the others as well. So if you're good at one task, you tend to be good at others too. But we do see that there's a lot of variation there. So it isn't like a perfect correlation. It isn't like this one underlying factor is good at explaining everything. It must be involved, but there's also more to it. And of course, if I'm talking about, well, we have one underlying thing that contributes to intelligence, but we need to add extra layers on top of that to get a more accurate prediction of how somebody scores in terms of different types of intelligence or different aspects of intelligence. That logic led Spearman to ask, is there actually a hierarchy of abilities within intelligence? So one overarching intelligence score with different, say, subcategories that would each have their own scores, and to determine how somebody might perform within a certain category, we actually have to consider both the overarching score and the different components that fall underneath that in our next level. So that gets us into our two-factor theory of intelligence. Now, this theory said that if we're trying to explain the fact that we have sort of general, overall positive correlations between certain sort of cognitive tasks that any individual is going to get, but we're still going to be seeing some individual differences between different specific tests, then we must have some combination of two aspects. So this two-factor theory of intelligence focuses on our first factor being this general intelligence or general intellectual ability. And Spearman called this G. And sometimes when you're looking at the literature, you'll see this called a G factor, but it's just talking about general intelligence. And this is what explains that correlation between scores. So if you have a high G, then you're typically going to perform fairly high on other cognitive tasks. Now, if you have low, then you're going to typically score lower on those cognitive tasks. But to explain the fact that some tasks are going to be better than others, even though there is that positive correlation there, he then talks about his second factor, which are these skills that are specific to a given task. So these specific skills are going to be kind of like this here, where we have this bottom layer labeled as S's. So these are going to be individual cognitive tasks. So this is just pulled from one of the figures in the textbook that I have modified because we actually are going to find that this model is not a complete explanation. But we do see things like how good are people at recalling things. So if I give you a list of words, how good are you at remembering them? This here, they're using things like remembering movies or birthdays or whatever. But we'd find that people who are typically good at remembering one type of thing, and that would show sort of that positive correlation with the fact that they can remember other things and solve basic logic problems. So we're going to see that general intelligence contributes to that overall. They're more likely to do fairly well on them all, or more likely to do poorly on them all. But we'll have some of these specific tasks that we are good at, some that we might not be quite as good at. And those S's are specific skills relevant to these tasks, help explain that variation between our different cognitive abilities. And I did hint that this kind of works. It explains what Spearman had been observing, but it did not completely explain our understanding. So we're going to build on this. Now, as we've noticed, is primarily the case within psychology, when we have one individual who has a strong opinion on something, we typically find that soon after we talk about another individual who has some opposing idea. And that's exactly what happened here, where we started off with Spearman having this idea of our two different factors, our general intelligence, then followed up by our specific abilities or our specific skills, and we needed to consider both to understand how somebody might perform on given cognitive tasks. Thurstone came in next and said, okay, but when we look at this data, we should be interpreting it differently. If we're seeing these correlations, here's how I want to interpret this. So Thurstone noticed that, yeah, there is this overall positive correlation between an individual's performance on one cognitive task and other cognitive tasks. But there are far stronger correlations when we start looking within clusters of tasks that have some similar nature to them. So things like people who are good at those memory tasks, things like remembering lists of words, or maybe remembering if you show them a bunch of images, or even remembering our movie titles, you'll typically find that there is a very, very strong correlation there. And so when we look within these clusters, we have very high correlations. And when we look between clusters, so say we look not just at our memory abilities, but let's look at another cluster that gets into, say, mathematics and logic, reasoning, that cluster might, again, have a high correlation within the group, but the difference between the groups would show a much weaker correlation. And so Thurstone interpreted this, saying that this clustering, this ability to find these really, really strong correlations within groups and weaker correlations between groups, is evidence against the existence of this G. And there must be something else. So he actually argued for describing just those individual clusters. So let's have just a few stable and relatively independent primary mental abilities, and those are what make up intelligence. Now, you might notice that some of the terminology here sounds familiar versus some of our earlier discussions about psychometrics in general. talking about strong correlations within a group and less strong correlations between groups, that sounds an awful lot like our factor analysis from the first section of this chapter. And indeed, that's where this headed next, where to try and figure out what's actually going on, they can perform a factor analysis to look at the data in a more sort of objective fashion. Now, back in sort of section 1, when we were talking about factor analysis, we talked about the statistical technique in general. And we'd said that it's going to be looking at a large data set where we have a bunch of our non-independent measures. In this case, those non-independent measures would be our individual scores across multiple different types of cognitive tasks. And then we'd say, all right, based on this individual scores across all of these tasks, what patterns are we seeing? So we use this statistical technique to collapse all of those sort of interconnected measures into things that are going to be more independent, our clusters that are going to show us these things tend to be related to one another. And of course, we're doing a lot of hand waving here. We're doing a lot of behind the scenes. We are calculating out equations that are going to allow us to look at an individual's scores and see sort of what patterns exist here. So I guess first off, let's talk about why we're calling it a confirmatory factor analysis. The reason for this is because we actually have our different theories, where we have Thurstone, who's convinced that this is going to be just looking at a bunch of independent clusters, and that's going to be our best way of explaining everything. We don't need a G factor. We don't need more than that. As long as we look at these clusters, that should be sufficient to explain human intelligence. And then, of course, Spearman says that we need our G, we need our general intelligence score, as well as our specific ability scores for individual skills and tasks. And the question becomes, which one is more correct, or which one is most useful? So because we're actually testing sort of some existing ideas, we're calling it confirmatory factor analysis. We're trying to confirm which model is going to work best. I know our text doesn't go into that a ton, but I figured I'd talk about it since we did mention factor analysis in a lot more detail earlier, so I wanted to tie the two together. So same concept, but this time being used with a little bit more of a hypothesis testing approach almost. But yeah, so what do we actually find? So what their factor analysis found across tons and tons of data sets, and this is something that's been tested even since they came to this initial conclusion. This is something that's been confirmed thousands and thousands of times. They actually see that both individuals were correct, that it's not just our G, our general intelligence, and our specific skills, and it's also not just our individual clusters or groups of abilities, it's actually both, which leads us to having 3 different levels of intelligence, 3 different sort of abilities and things that we can look at. And having 3 of those levels are general intelligence at the top, are sort of clusters of abilities or groupings of abilities and sort of factors that explain those groups in the middle, with our specific task relevant abilities at the bottom. That matches that idea that we see are sort of weak correlations across all of the scores, and having sort of one factor that can show us that somebody tends to be higher or lower on average across all of them, plus the specific differences where people can be really good at things like logic and maybe a little bit less good at things like reading and interpretation and verbal stuff. So we'll find that we get these really strong correlations within our clusters of similar tests, where those scores are going to be higher correlated within a group when they maybe pull on an underlying ability. But we do still see the weaker correlation across all of them that's important to interpret and understand when we're trying to sort of describe somebody's intellectual ability as a whole. So we've added this level of complexity, and we're now actually at a 3-level hierarchy rather than Spearman's original 2-level or 2-factor hierarchy. And we've basically just stuck Thurstone's sort of clusters somewhere in the middle, sort of marrying the two theories together. So what does this 3-level hierarchy look like? We're going to say that we have those general intelligence scores at the top. So G stays at the top. We then have our mid-level abilities or our middle abilities, which you'll sometimes see called, say, group factors or group abilities. Those are going to be the same as what Thurstone had called his primary mental abilities, those clusters where we see that tasks that use or have sort of similar properties, things like memory or logic or verbal stuff, those are all going to cluster nicely. So those primary mental abilities are now our middle level abilities. And then of course the specific abilities at the bottom. And that would look something like this, which is where you're going to see that similar figure we already had, but now with this M level in the middle, this was the figure I had modified to show us earlier. So this has general intelligence at the top. We have to consider somebody's general intelligence score when we're trying to understand their performance. That is then going to be modified based on which sort of broad category an ability is going to fall under. So memory stuff, that's where that recalling movie titles and remembering birthdays might fall under. So these two tasks would have fairly high correlations because they're both falling under this broader category of memory ability. And our general intelligence is going to say that we have a fairly a weaker correlation as compared to the within group stuff here between our different M mid-level abilities here. So an individual who's really good at memory is probably going to be pretty good at reasoning, but it's not a perfect correlation here. But if we look at people who are good at recalling movie titles, they're probably also very good at remembering birthdays. The relationship between these two is much stronger. So these guys are more closely related, and these guys are more closely related to each other. And these are going to be weakly related, but nowhere near as strong as these clusters. So that's how we're putting together all the data that we've observed into our 3-level hierarchy here. Now, if we do agree, and a lot of people do, and a lot of the data does, if we agree on this 3-level hierarchy, we have sort of our general, mid-level, and our specific abilities, you can probably figure that not everyone's going to agree on exactly what things are going to fall into each of these categories. I will note that when we're looking at the specific abilities at the bottom, there are too many of these to actually label every single one of them. That's because the way that we talk about this, if this is a specific ability to a specific task, then there are as many S's as there are different cognitive tasks that we might put to an individual. So we're not trying to label all of these. And you'll notice things like recalling movie titles and remembering birthdays are very, very specific. That's why. But we can have an interesting debate on what our middle level abilities should be, because of course people are going to have different ways of breaking down intelligence and sort of describing these clusters, these sort of things that we might measure that are all going to correlate strongly because they're using some similar underlying ability. And of course, again, this should be familiar because we talked about some of these techniques to begin with. How do we actually decide how to break down these middle-level abilities? We can go with a data-based approach or a theory-based approach, just like we said before. Now, our data-based approach, this is again focusing on, say, that factor analysis, going with a more statistical technique, saying, I have tons of data where I have all sorts of different cognitive tasks for tons of different individuals. Let's try and collapse this massive data set into these nice controlled factors or clusters that are going to be relatively independent of one another. But we can also have a theory-based approach where we actually start by looking at sort of our intelligence and making a theoretical or logical determination of how we could break down that one overarching idea into what should be maybe independent components. But we always stress that the data-based approach, if we're doing it statistically, we're actually trying to get independent clusters. So those are going to be as independent as we can get them. Theory-based approaches are pretty much guaranteed to have some overlap between them, but as we said earlier, there's some trade-offs here as well, where the data-based approaches are only as strong as the data you have available, whereas theory-based approaches can be a little bit more free because we're not limited by the data we have. To finish off this section, we're going to take some time and actually talk about a couple of examples of our models that use a data-based approach and some models that use our theory-based approaches. So for each of these, we're just going to pick a couple of highlights. With the data-based ones, we're going to look at Thurstone again, because while we've kind of just talked about him in terms of how he sort of contrasted and then ended up collaborating with or building upon the stuff from Spearman, we actually end up seeing that when he was talking about those primary mental abilities, he actually had a model that proposed which mental abilities those were. So he had actually described the different clusters and how he would break down our sort of idea of intelligence into some distinct and independent groupings. But we also have other individuals. So we'll talk about Carroll as well. And getting into the theory-based stuff, we talk about Sternberg and even Gardner, as well as a couple of sort of specific, more theory-leaning ideas of intelligence, things like emotional intelligence. So that's where we're going to take this next, actually applying some of the stuff we've been talking about. Now, the first thing that I want to mention is the fact that, okay, if both Thurstone and Carroll have these data-based approaches, and they are both working from large databases, like large data sets of lots and lots of different cognitive testing scores, why do they have different models? If it's all based on data and intelligence should be broken down into these predictable categories, why are they not identical? And this is actually just something to do with the fact that when you're conducting a factor analysis, then you're kind of deciding where your cutoffs are. We don't need to know the specifics of the statistics themselves, but the idea is that when you're conducting that analysis, you have to decide where are you drawing those lines. Yes, we are going to have stronger correlations within each of these categories or within each of these clusters or factors as compared to sort of weaker correlations, weaker associations outside of those clusters. But you want to decide sort of how similar, how highly correlated do these things need to be before we call them a cluster. And so depending on how you do that behind the scenes statistics stuff, you can end up with slightly different clusters because of those cutoffs, because of those thresholds that you've set. So like I said, you don't need to know all of that. I just find that sometimes people wonder, hey, if we're working off of similar data, why are they not identical? And that's why. It's just the nature of how they conduct the analysis. And you're actually going to start finding that even though they are different models, there are a lot of similarities. There's a lot of overlap in how they've chosen to break stuff down. And that's totally fine because that does show that when we're looking at data sets and breaking intelligence down, we're going to find a lot of these patterns. So even if we are looking at the data slightly differently, the clusters tend to be somewhat consistent. So just a little bit of that disclaimer before we get into Thurstone and talking about his 7 independent primary mental abilities. So this is what he had proposed even before he had his stuff integrated with Spearman, whose name, for whatever reason, I keep forgetting. But before we got into that sort of 3-level hierarchy, he had proposed these as his primary mental abilities. These are what ended up becoming those middle level abilities within that 3-level hierarchy. So we have his breakdown was verbal comprehension, so how well you understand spoken things, word fluency, how well you speak, so that eloquency and fluidness in your speaking, which I always end up tripping over. Number facility. This is just looking at sort of your ability to work with numbers. Things like mathematics would fall in and around there. Spatial visualization is looking at things in your environment. So can you figure out where things are located? Can you interact with things in a three-dimensional space? Associative memory is remembering things and linking them together. Perceptual speed is just how quickly you can sort of see things, notice things, or respond to things. And then reasoning is more of a broad, general logic application. So because we're not going into tons of detail on any of these, we're just acknowledging that these are sort of categories that are going to be different from one another. And this is how Thurstone decided to break down all of those clusters in his factor analysis. We're going to find that Carroll has something very similar. So now instead of our 7 independent mid-level abilities, we're going to have 8 of them. So Carroll had a slightly different approach, a different interpretation, maybe slightly different data, but similar. And if we look at what's in here, we're going to have some overlap once again. So memory and learning, yeah, we can find that might be one of the other ones we had in the last model. Visual perception, that's pretty similar. Auditory perception, all right. Retrieval ability, that's all about retrieving stored information. Cognitive speediness, that's a lot like this. Perceptual speed, processing speed, that can be part of, oops, wrong way. What was that? So processing speed might tie into some reasoning, might still be perceptual speed, it depends. But the ones that we care the most about here are actually the last two. So crystallized intelligence and fluid intelligence. And I'm focusing on these because they keep coming up. We mentioned these first when we were talking about development and the fact that as we get older, we tend to have different patterns in terms of crystallized versus fluid intelligence. So before we talk about those specifically, though, I just wanted to show the fact that Carroll's idea of these mid-level abilities maps nicely in with what we had from Spearman in that 3-level hierarchy. So here at the top, we still have our G factor or general intelligence or just G. Our broad stratum here would be, or a broad stratum 2 is just level 2. This would be that middle level order in that hierarchy. So that's the M's. And at the bottom, we have narrow or specific are S's. So same basic idea, just because this was Carroll's idea, he kept the same, general and specific above and below, but of course named them slightly differently. And if we look across, these are the 8 things, more or less, that were just on that previous slide. And as per usual, I don't need sort of the specifics of what does it mean to have good broad retrieval ability, but more of, fluid and crystallized intelligence that we're focusing on. And maybe if I tell you that somebody is really focused on the fact that what's one that doesn't overlap between them? Maybe we're going to look at broad visual perception. Maybe there isn't overlap over here with visual perception. Maybe they just said perceptual speed, but not visual specific. That might be able to tell you that if they care about visual perception, it's one but not the other. That's if I'm really desperate for questions and don't have anything else I would ask about. But with an open book test, that's kind of what we're able to do. All right, next. So that breakdown between fluid and crystallized intelligence, like I said before, this is nothing new. Fluid intelligence is fluid and flexible. So this is our ability to make logical inferences, to recognize abstract concepts, especially in the absence of any prior experience or knowledge that would help us interpret the information we're faced with in the moment. So we're dealing with novel situations and we're thinking abstractly without any previous knowledge, without any previous experience. That's the stuff that we had talked about in development as being higher when we are younger, like specifically sort of young adults. Children and intelligence breakdown is its own can of worms and it gets complicated. So we're just focusing on adult intelligence. But fluid intelligence tends to be higher when we are younger, simply because we are able to think more quickly. But also because we don't have other types of intelligence to necessarily rely on early on. In contrast, our crystallized intelligence is something that typically improves as we get older. And this is because this is our ability to make use of stuff we've learned through experience. So, our ability to retain and use knowledge that we've gained as we've encountered situations in the past. So, we can use previously learned knowledge in order to sort of solve current problems or to recognize current patterns. So, as we get older, we've encountered more situations, more scenarios, and therefore we have more knowledge at our fingertips. So we're able to solve problems using that broader sort of pool of experience, and we don't have to rely on creative thinking as time goes on. Now, of course, there's always going to be a trade off here. With fluid intelligence, we might not find the correct solution because we're trying to think creatively. And in fact, when we're being extra creative with our thought problems or thoughts, problem solving and thought patterns, we actually might find that we frame something differently than maybe we should have. So we might find creative solutions that aren't really the solution that was needed. The contrast with crystallized intelligence, well, we might not be able to solve something unless we've encountered it before, or we can get into that idea of mental sets, where if we've encountered a fairly similar problem in the past, we might get stuck only thinking about stuff that's worked to solve those problems in the past, even if it won't work now. So, in some cases, we kind of need a little bit of experience and maybe need a little bit of creative thinking. So, it makes sense to be able to use both. But we can sort of rely on one or the other more or less. And because these are meant to be two of those sort of types of mid level abilities, these are clusters that sort of stand alone. So you might be higher in fluid intelligence and lower in crystallized intelligence, just depending on what your M is based on that model. And with fluid intelligence, this is something that might be a little bit harder to try and interpret and test. Because with crystallized stuff, we're talking about using experience, using existing knowledge. This is something that's typically tested on a standard IQ test pretty easily. And in fact, a lot of IQ tests, especially the old ones, focused mainly on crystallized intelligence. But with fluid intelligence showing that creativity and flexibility in thought processes, that's not necessarily as straightforward to test. And one of the most famous ways of testing fluid intelligence is actually the Raven's progressive matrices test. So this is a test that's special for a couple of different reasons. So it is a test of fluid intelligence because it's getting us to look at combinations of shapes and colors, or here sort of black versus striped versus white, and you're trying to recognize patterns. And there's all sorts of different types of patterns that you could be faced with. So we're looking at how do you respond to novel patterns? Can you learn what the pattern is to correctly fill in that blank? Now, the other reason why this is really special is because this is entirely symbol based. So it's not language specific. We're able to use sort of non-verbal situations. We can show people images and ask them to fill in that blank. And this was specifically important because, as I've said before, there's a lot of bias when it comes to intelligence testing, and not just the original old school intelligence tests, but even modern intelligence tests. If we look at a standard IQ test, even one of the sort of widely accepted ones, if you have a Canadian version versus an American version, a Canadian will score higher on a Canadian test than an American will, and the other way as well. So a Canadian won't perform as well on an American test as an American will. And that seems like such a small thing. We're all part of North America. What's going on there? Well, different countries will have differences in, say, language, how we talk about things. Canada has a lot of sort of French stuff that's integrated in how we talk about things. We also tend to have some British sayings thrown in as well, on top of things like using lots of extra U's in our writing. But our schooling systems are also going to be different. We are taught things in different ways. There are different standards and all sorts of other things. So if we can see differences in performance on standardized IQ tests between Canada and America, can you imagine how large the differences would be if we looked at, say, Canada and some other country, even if they speak English? So, depending on all of these other cultural things, as well as language components, because different languages are going to talk about things in different ways and can influence our ability to sort of interpret questions and problems and stuff like that. So, with all of those potential issues, this Raven's progressive matrix was put forward as a way of testing people without having that language barrier. So this can be tested as is without us having to, say, translate it from one language to another. Instead, it's all symbol based, so it's not language specific. It doesn't rely on verbal components, and therefore it was hoped to be a little bit less culturally biased. As always, there's still going to be differences between cultures because whoever designs a test has their own way of thinking about what's important in terms of evaluating abilities. So, this pattern recognition is important to the group that made the test, but it might not be as important to the group that you're testing. So, even though the goal here was to try and reduce some of that bias between languages and between cultures, and it does a better job than most of the other tests, it is still not perfect. So it is still going to involve some bias, but at least they sort of did what they could to try and mitigate it as much as possible. But yeah, okay, so that's our one test of fluid intelligence. But I want to keep moving and get into some of our theory-based models in terms of deciding how we're going to label all of those middle level abilities. So Sternberg talked about this triarchic theory of intelligence. So this one, instead of starting with our data, like those data-based approaches, and doing a factor analysis to determine which clusters we have, and focusing on having these independent clusters, Sternberg, and when we get into Gardner, it's going to be the same. They started with an idea of these are things that I think goes with human intelligence. These are three categories that they believe describes human mental ability. So in these cases, we're not actually looking at data and trying to sort of crunch it down into these independent groups. We're now just saying, all right, what do I think is going on here? And as we said before, looking at those pros and cons between data-based versus theory-based approaches, our theory-based approaches are really useful when looking at certain categories of certain mid-level abilities where we don't necessarily have tests that can evaluate it the way that we might want to, or that maybe they're harder to test or impossible to test depending on the model. So, what did he come up with? So, our three things are analytic intelligence, creative or synthetic intelligence, and then practical intelligence. And we're seeing here we have sort of our creative or synthetic intelligence lines up with that idea of fluid intelligence, which is pretty interesting to see that consistency. With each of these, though, so the creative or synthetic intelligence is we're generating new solutions, but here they're saying that these novel solutions, this creativity might be a new way of applying stuff that we already know about. So it isn't necessarily saying that it has to be completely novel and separate and unconnected to anything else. So it's creativity and new applications, but we're not excluding the possibility of using some existing knowledge. So already we're seeing that this crosses some of our original clusters from the other models. So this is pulling from maybe multiple underlying skills, depending on the model we're using. For analytic intelligence, this is looking at sort of that analytic and logical thought processing. So can you problem solve? Can you look at things and find patterns? Could you sort of work through a logic problem? This is the one that would be sort of our traditional intelligence tests. This is going to be a little bit more in line with things like our crystallized intelligence. But again, it's not going to be a perfect overlap because this is something where we're not starting with data, we're starting with an idea, a theory. The third of these is our practical intelligence. And this is looking at not so much sort of where the information is coming from, but the fact that we're using our abilities in a practical way. So in our everyday, day-to-day life, how do we actually put our problem solving into action? And looking at all of these, and I've even been pointing out the fact that, hey, this kind of overlaps with one or more of the other models' ideas of these mid level abilities. You can probably think of situations where you'd make use of multiple of these types of intelligence. So, not all problems that would require intelligence to solve are going to pull from only one of these categories. And you can probably also think of some problems that none of these categories would help with. So, this isn't really meant to be an sort of complete explanation of all of human intelligences, and that's actually one of the critiques of this theory, of this breakdown of intelligence, is that it's not going to cover everything, and it's not sort of as independent as some of the other models. Now, if your focus is on everyday usage and day-to-day employment of different problem-solving abilities, then maybe this still works for you. With all of these models, no one is more correct or less correct. They're all just framing things differently and having different perspectives and different focuses. Our next one here is Gardner, and Gardner's not actually in our textbook, at least not as explicitly as all of the others, but I figured he would be worth mentioning. So he proposed 8 kind of ish independent intelligences. Now, they're not necessarily independent because this is still a theory-based approach. But he was trying to describe things that logically he thought wouldn't overlap. So I just wanted to point out, while we're trying to say like they're relatively independent, in as much as he could come up with within his theory. And that's actually, again, one of those things where we have critiques for this because it doesn't necessarily line up with our more data-based approaches. So he focused on things like, well, linguistics, mathematical and logic-based, visuospatial, music. But now we get into the cool stuff, things like body kinesthetic knowledge. So this would be like an athlete would be really good at this, good awareness of where their body is in space. Naturalistic, knowing about you and your environment. Inter and intrapersonal, understanding interactions between people and within themselves. These are all fairly different from what we've seen so far. And that's why this ends up being a really nice bridge to start talking about things like emotional intelligence as well. So there are sort of additions that have been proposed. There's a 9th possible intelligence called existential intelligence under this theory, looking at sort of our understanding of our existence and the fact that our lives are finite and things like that. But that's not always included. And as I've said, there isn't a lot of empirical support for this, so people tend to struggle quite a bit with sort of finding ways to say, yes, these are relatively independent, because it is theory-based and not necessarily data supported. Now, I have mentioned our emotional intelligence a couple of times, all the way from the beginning of this chapter, but we're finally going to talk about it now. And while the concept of emotional intelligence is something that has a whole bunch of different associated theories and lots of different researchers describing sort of what emotional intelligence is in their views, we're going to go with sort of one of the earlier interpretations from Mayer and Salovey, who described emotional intelligence as our ability to understand and reason using emotions. So emotions are getting into, say, feelings and expressions and that sort of internal state, which is, again, one of those reasons why this falls under the idea of a theory-based, at least, component. It isn't necessarily an entire approach by itself, since it is just one aspect of intelligence, but this is an aspect of intelligence that's usually brought up because there is some theory, some idea, a logical statement that this is something people are good or not good at. It's a little bit harder to quantify, which is why it's not always included in those more data-based approaches. So, if we're saying that somebody has high emotional intelligence, they're really good at reasoning and understanding emotions, what kinds of things are they going to be good at doing? Well, they're probably going to be aware of and be able to accurately read and interpret the emotions of both themselves and others. So they're going to know what they are feeling, they're going to know what other people are feeling, and how to react in those situations. So if you are emotionally intelligent, you might see that someone's upset and take actions to make them comfortable, to make them less upset. So responding to emotions appropriately would be under that. This also includes things like regulating and controlling your own emotions. So you have to be aware of if you're having an extreme emotion that maybe you don't want to be, you'd be able to reduce that. So if you're really angry about something, you'd recognize that anger and not get caught up in it, and maybe find a way to mediate it, maybe some way to vent it or hold on to it until later. This can also be things like using your emotions to help motivate you. So if you really, really, really want to do something, you might focus on how amazing it's going to feel when you finish it, all those feelings of accomplishment, and you can use that to sort of push yourself to try harder or to work better. So those are some things that fall under emotional intelligence. And I suppose before I move on to the last slide in this section, we can also just mention things like, obviously, if you have high emotional intelligence, you're probably going to have better social interactions. So more social skills, maybe you get along with people better, have fewer interpersonal conflicts, maybe you have more friends. We'll find on, say, expression or sort of emotion from vocal components, tasks. So if we show people pictures of people making faces, or if we get you to listen to people talking, can you accurately tell us what they're feeling, what emotion they're experiencing? If you're high in this emotional intelligence, you'd be really good at that. We also find that if we're doing brain scans, if we have research watching what kind of activity is happening within your brain, people who are high in emotional intelligence will actually show a lot less effortful processing, less brain activity going on when they're trying to solve problems that relate to emotions. So they don't have to work as hard, and the idea of, hey, they're experiencing this emotion, or I should react to this emotion in this way, comes without as much sort of intention and internal action or internal processing required. Whereas people who struggle with emotional intelligence might have to spend more time thinking about it, might put in more effortful processing, and we'd see it as more activity in the relevant areas of the brain. So lots of interesting studies looking at emotional intelligence, but again, it's something that's a little bit difficult to quantify because not everyone agrees on what falls under this category or not. And trying to quantify things like social skills or ability to respond appropriately in emotional situations might be a little bit difficult to monitor and record for research. And then, of course, our very last slide here is just looking at a brief discussion of intelligence across cultures. And this is nothing new. I've been mentioning this as we've been going through the chapter. The idea that there are going to be natural biases within any kind of investigation of intelligence. And there's lots of different reasons, but this slide gets us to put a bunch of them all together in one place. So we know that different cultures conceptualize intelligence very differently. What is it that they prioritize? What is it that's important within that group? So maybe there's a group, whether it's sort of culture in terms of, say, a country or a particular race, or whether it's a specific small group of individuals within a particular city. As we've said before, sort of social cultural stuff can be many, many different scales. But within this culture, are they going to prioritize empirical reasoning? Are they going to focus on ancestral knowledge and the use of that in terms of modern settings? There are all sorts of things that they might find more or less important in what they think intelligence means to them. And of course, it's not just cultural values that are going to play into what they prioritize. This can also be related to things like language. We've talked about that linguistic relativity theory earlier on, saying that, yeah, it kind of plays a role if we look at things like experience and category formation. That can apply here too. But yeah, we're going to see that different cultures have lots of things like different environments that they're in, different kinds of social interactions that are acceptable or not acceptable. We start looking at social norms differ between cultures, and language for sure plays differences there as well. That's going to be important to note. We do see that across all cultures, we often have sort of a heightened what am I trying to say there? A priority for the ability to solve problems. So we know that solving problems and being able to sort of fix issues to come up with solutions is important, regardless of where you are and overall what kinds of problems you face. But we're going to have priorities assigned to different types of problems. And there might be sort of priorities towards what types of methods are going to be sort of more or less valued within a given group just because of all those other factors that vary. And then one last thing to note here before we move on, while I definitely have a bias towards more data-based approaches simply because of my own research experience and the fact that I really like having lots of data to work on, we always want to acknowledge that data-based approaches still are going to have that limitation that they can only include that which their data includes. So when we have parts of the world that traditionally don't have a lot of intelligence tests, or parts of the world where they don't have intelligence tests that are specific to their group. I had mentioned earlier our North American intelligence tests, where Canadian versus American can cause problems and differences in results. Imagine going across sort of multiple different areas of the world, possibly with no cultural considerations taken, so we don't re-standardize it for a new group. That can definitely bias their data. And of course, if the data is biased, then the models built on it are going to be biased. So our data approaches are going to have that inherent bias, and will also have sort of gaps or blind spots because a lot of parts of the world don't have the same kind of focus on intelligence testing and sort of evaluating all these different cognitive tasks and their scores. So it's completely excluded from a lot of those models. So just keeping those limitations in mind while we're thinking about these different models and how we use them.